Testing the sound, testing.
Hera. The angel came to him in it and the proud to read. The angel caught me forcefully and pressed me so hard that I could not bear it anymore. He then released me and asked me to read. And I replied, I do not know how to read. Whereupon he caught me again and pressed me a second time until I could not bear it anymore. Then he released me and asked me again to read. But again I replied, I do not know how to read. Or, what shall I read? Thereupon he caught me for the third time and pressed me and then released me and said, read in the name of your Lord, who has created all that exists. He has created man from a clot. Read, and your Lord is most generous, up to that which he knew not. Then Muhammad returned with the inspiration, his neck muscles twitching with terror, till he entered upon Khadijah and said, cover me, cover me. What is wrong with me? Then he told her everything that had happened and said, I fed to me. Khadijah said, never, but have the glad tidings, for by Allah, Allah will never disgrace you, as you keep good relations with your kin and kith. Speak the truth, help the poor and the destitute, serve your guests generously, and assist the deserving, calamity-afflicted ones. Khadijah then accompanied him to her cousin Waraqah bin Nawfal bin Asad bin Abdul Uzza, long name, who during the pre-Islamic period became a Christian and used to write the writing with Hebrew letters. He would write from the gospel in Hebrew as much as Allah wished him to write. He was an old man and had lost his weight. Khadijah said to Waraqah, listen to the story of your nephew, O my cousin. Waraqah said, O my nephew, what have you seen? Allah's apostle described whatever he had seen. Waraqah said, this is the same one who keeps the secrets, Angel Gabriel, whom Allah has sent to Moses. I wish I were young and could live up to the time where your people would turn you out. Muhammad asked, will they drive me out? Waraqah replied in the affirmative and said, anyone, man, who came with something similar to what you have brought was treated with hostility. And if I should remain alive till the day when you will be turned out, then I would support you strongly. But after a few days, Waraqah died, and the divine inspiration was also paused for a while. And the prophet became so sad, as we have heard, that he intended several times to throw himself from the tops of high mountains. And every time he went up to the top of a mountain in order to throw himself down, Gabriel would appear before him and say, O Muhammad, you are indeed Allah's apostle in truth. Whereupon his heart will become quiet and he will calm down and will return home. And whenever the period of the calming of the inspiration used to become long, he would do as before. But when he used to reach the top of a mountain, Gabriel would appear before him and say to him what he has said before. There are a number of slight variations to this story, related by different people, describing Muhammad's visitation by a spirit, identifying himself as the angel Gabriel. These stories do not always agree with each other in perfect detail, but on the whole, a complete picture can be drawn of Muhammad's initial experience with the spirit and his reactions after. And that's what I just presented. From this encounter, Muslims believe that Allah, through the archangel Gabriel, gave the collection of revelations to Muhammad that are now preferred as the Islamic scriptures.
All right, shalom, shalom, family. Shalom, shalom. Let's say the Lord's Prayer, and then we're going to get right into some deep topics. Our Father in heaven, name, may thy kingdom come, may thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses against us, and lead us on the righteous path, and guard us from the evil one. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen, amen. Shalom, shalom, shalom. All right, so I want to bring a very topic because one of the very interesting things about what we study is we look at a lot of ancient cultures and what we do, and but is we bring scripture to every topic, right? We bring the scripture to every topic. So let's say you were standing somewhere and someone said to you, now, why would you use the scripture as a historical topic? Why would you use the scriptures? What makes you think the scriptures, right? The God of the Bible, the Israelites, all that stuff. Why would you? What would be your biggest evidence of showing that the biblical narrative is real? So, what I want to do is show you the methodology to go about and show that the biblical narrative is real. So first, you got to start with the oldest known reference to the biblical narrative. Now, what is the oldest known reference to the biblical narrative? Right? It's Genesis. So if we Genesis by His word, let's go to Genesis 1, and let's first start off with the first scripture, and then let's go to different historical topics on this. So this one's pretty fast, very quick. The easy one. So all you have to do is go to Genesis 1 and make a statement on two verses. So steps to the world. That's believe in God or you don't, right? Everything else is you don't. Everything else. Buddhism, atheism, it don't matter. But once you understand God's creation and anything else is creation, like the science, right? What's the creation of science? Everything began as a beginning. Everything was chaos. You get the Helion era, where it basically was basically like a world of lava, and all of a sudden you get the I forget you say Archean or something like that era, where you get the time where the world is filled with water, right? What's interesting is that how do we get a transition from chaos to order? How do we get a transition to order to right? Where does the water world come from? We also can express that there was a water world in the beginning. We know that scientifically. But notice right here it says, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness upon the face of the deep. So the earth began as water, right? All we have to do is prove that the earth began as water. And if we can prove that earth began as water, then we the first source, right? Which is the understanding of creation. That he gives us the understanding of creation. We do that, right? You found something like this. Ocean world, and you could say 3 billion. And someone would say to you, well, that's a long time ago. Well, yeah, that is a long time ago because in the beginning, like he said, he created all things and it was literally a water world. So we actually got evidence that 3 billion years ago, Earth was literally a water world. So the beginning of the Earth was a water world. And you know what's also interesting about that? Science actually can't tell you why it was a water world. They can't tell you why the whole Earth was actually a ball of water, practically an ocean. Why the whole world's an ocean. That would be one of the most first vital sources is getting a foundation of the creation, right? Showing that our creation makes more sense of the illusion of madness, right? That ocean world, right? That's source one. Now someone's like, well, sure, we can get into the science and all those things and whatnot. But what about the historicity of the book, right? Let's forget about the science. What about the history? And let's say they say the Bible has no exact history with the book. What should you do to prove the biblical narrative? Because by the time, let's also remember this. Let me actually open up a timeline here. Let's go to a timeline, right? Because this is what if you want to prove the Bible historically, you gotta know a little bit about the timeline, right? There's a little bit. And let's say you want to figure out the timeline. Let's use this for example. All right, so who writes the Bible? Who's giving us the narrative of the Bible? That's something also important to know when reading the book. Is that we're not getting something written by Adam at his time. We're getting something that's written a little later in a later generation about something that was previous, right? We're getting a history of something that happened before. So what's interesting is that the story starts off with a very accurate narrative of the creation, right? But let's just jump a little ahead and get a little understanding on some things, right? So let's say we go from Adam to Abraham. Let's get a good understanding of it. And let's say about the time of Moses. So we're going to just jump. You can see from Noah, that was a catastrophic event causing a global bottleneck. And then you seeing that Abraham would exist. Now, Abraham would exist about 2000 to about 17 BC, right? So in between that time frame, we would have Abraham pop up, right? So from Terah to Abraham, right, you're going to get Abraham popping up. So that's a very historical concept. Now, the land that we're going to be focusing on is Israel, around under the land of Mesopotamia. Now, what's important is Abraham doesn't write the Bible, right? The Bible is given to a certain group that leaves the land of Egypt. Now, someone might say, hold on, what do you mean they left the land of Egypt? How do we know that they left the land of Egypt? Why would Israel, if they went into the land of Egypt, why would they leave Egypt and go into Israel? Why wouldn't they go somewhere else? How do we know that they left Egypt and went into Israel, right? What's the oldest? And this is what someone would say, what's some evidence for that? What's the oldest evidence for that? Let me show you what you can use to get the best evidence if you're on the spot and you need to prove the biblical narrative. All you have to do is remember the name Israel. And you can find this very easily. Type down Israel and something called stele, right? It's going to take you to the Merneptah stele. And you can know Merneptah, but Merneptah is much harder. So I'm showing you the methodology in this for the sake of being on the spot. If you pull up the Israel stele, it's going to be one of the earliest sources for the evidence of the people called Israel. So it's going to be one of your first rolling stones, I would say. I think should be a centerpiece in a conversation when talking about Israel, the Merneptah stele, because it's going to start off where you're going to lean. So which way are you going to go? You're going to jump right next to the Moabites as the Israelites come out of Egypt and start dealing with the Moabites. If we do that, another way of going about is using, as is not a source, right? Wiki is not a source, but it's encyclopedia, which is going to be basically a bank which having some different information, which is going to lead to sources. So this is going to be the source, is this stone. It's going to be your source. So that's going to be very important. So we got a lot of different things that usually Wiki is going to have different comments from different people. You can just scroll right to the bottom and see what all citations is going to be using and everything. Right? Getting a good understanding of what citations is going to be using, what different stuff. I have the first reference of Israel, right? You can go to places with their libraries and different things like that, right? You can go to their museums to get a more pinpoint definition of it if someone doesn't like the wiki, how that is about. But just if you show this, let them know it's an encyclopedia, not a source. The source is what it's talking about, right? That's very important. And also the next step from here, right? You can express how they come out of Egypt, right? They go into the land, right? They settle in the land. They live there for a long time. And also, if anyone has any questions, or let's say they don't believe or something like that, any statements, there's a time to throw it out. Because I was just talking to a brother that was kind of misinformed about the biblical narrative, and he was like, "Well, the land of Israel was filled with Canaanites. Why would Israel come out of Egypt and go into the land controlled by Egypt?" That's why we're going to go a little bit more into it. So when Israel comes out, right, they come out at a certain time frame, right after a certain Exodus Pharaoh. Egyptologists have different ideas. The most credible, I believe, is Ramses II. Ramses II has the most high probability of being the pharaoh. But the best thing for just to explain this is first get an understanding of that Israel's there. You can also back this up by explaining that Israel was not in Jerusalem previous to this, because we got things like the Armana letters, right? In the what's called the Armana letters, we actually know that Jerusalem was filled with previous people there before the other people got there, before the Israelites came up there. So we know that that land was filled with different people, right? But then all of a sudden they talk about this pinpoint group called Israel, right? So you can show that this is the first time that this is actually called Israel. And scholars translate it as Israel, right? And if we talk about the sieges of Israel, what does Israel do after, right? Israel has a couple different things that happen, right? One of the major things that they do is that they fight with the Moabites. Well, there's this stone called the Meshach stele. So if you go, this is why I'm showing you Wiki, because if you go here, you'll have a couple different sources to click through. So here's your Meshach stele. You can click here, and then you notice that this is going to be now this is what's really interesting about this stone, right? It's really interesting because it is illustrating not only is it written by the Moabites in a Semitic script, right? In a Semitic script, it is also writing about a certain king of Israel. I'm going to just go to a summary of it as it talks about a couple different things. Now, the certain king of Israel that it talks about is a king named Omri, right? In fact, it goes right here in the 9th century. It says this a couple of things of the king of Israel named Omri and everything. And it just talks about pretty much what we have there. On this, you can also see quick summaries, right? They talk about scholarly information, what the scholars talk about, right? And they got their sources of what the scholars are talking about. Also got the translation, so you can get a little bit of what they have verified as the translation, as this is not a private find, but sometimes these things aren't known. So jumping right to the meat can really give some understanding on it. So this is what it basically describes, right? It describes how Moab was oppressed later by a king of Israel. Now, this is what's interesting because Israel didn't first start off as a kingdom. That was never described as a kingdom previously, right? This is not a neo Israel. This is proto Israel. This is the start of this nation. So this is the rise of a kingdom called Israel, right? So that's very important, so that we're getting a root understanding. And the only see this biography is in the Bible. That the Bible is actually a biography throughout all time, but it's actually a biography on God. That's what actually it is. But Israel is the children, is the ones that he's bringing up, that's bringing out, and they're going about, right? Israel's the group that he's calling, that's moving about. So we see right here Omri, king of Israel, and his son, right, as a result of the anger, and they say of the one of the idols, right, that even is talked about in the Bible that God said not to worship. So we can also verify in the Bible it talks about the same idol of the Moabites that God said not to worship, that the people of the land worshiped. So we got a perfect harmonic understanding of that time frame and who was there in that time frame. We can even get different nations and different, right? It just talk about men of Gad and different whatnot. And then it just talks about, that's the main things that we want to look at, is a couple of things of the scripture. Let's say they're not convinced yet. They want to get a little more deep. Now, how do we know that this is matching with history? Now, let's go back to over here. So go to another source. Let's look at the Tel Dan stele. Now, what's interesting about the Tel Dan stele is that it mentions a certain king from a certain family line. It tells us about this king and says that he is from basically the family of David, from the line of David. So again, going to the translation to see what's going on there, we can see what's going on there, and just to get a good understanding, here's a summary. This is basically what scholars have translated that. You can get a nice read of it. I'll just summarize it. What we see here, right? Here's the part that we want to see, right? It says, "Riot and 1,000 horsemen, right? I killed Jehoram, right? Son of Ahab, right? And it says, King of Israel, right? And I killed Ahaz, right? Ahaziah, son of Joram, right? Of the house of David." Now notice that this is interesting because we're seeing a writing in a Semitic script. Now, why is it important that both of these were in Semitic script? Because these were similar family ties in these lands. But this Moab group actually is important, that a lot of them were filled with also other nations. So that's important to know that area was actually highly mixed. But it's important to also know that in this reading, we are hearing the first time ever about David. Now, remember, David didn't leave in the Exodus. David popped up later. So the time frame that David's name is mentioned is exactly at the right time, right? Right after the Exodus. And then we're getting a mention of someone who's a son of David, because he says he's of the house, right? Of David. So that's important. So it lets us know that this one is of the house of David. And we can see that multiple translations let us know that indeed is definitely, without a doubt, letting us know that it's talking about a king of Israel and a couple different ones in that land, and also that they are of the house of David. So that's very deep and very important, because it's going to give us a very, very, very pinpoint understanding on the topic of if the biblical narrative is historically aligned. So we can see that already we're seeing a lot of things that's shown as historically back and to get a good understanding here. Now there's one more stone that I think, well, there's a couple different stones. There's a couple different stones, a couple different tablets, a couple different things. But if you want to do it real fast, I think getting to the root of the source of the story is going to really bring the story together and bring it home, you know. So there's a couple, the more sources you get of those times, the more you can bring an understanding of history. Because the Bible, the thing about the Bible, this is how we can trust the Bible, because as it speaks, it verifies itself as it speaks. That if it speaks throughout any time frame, throughout any king, throughout any diversity of the nations, it's not a book that was written later. It's a book that was written at that time as a biography, right? That's important. That is noting real events, real decisions that people are making, and real problems that are happening in that time. It is not hiding anything. It's letting us know the story, and it's giving us a summary. So that's important too, that we're getting the summary of all these things. And it's also letting us know that this book that we have also speaks that it is going to continue on, that it's not going to die, right? There's a lot of idols in Mesopotamia, a lot of idols in the land, but none of them have an evangelist still, right? We see that now we only have in this book a story that produced a people that was even spared, that even produced the message and the promise that it was speaking of in the future. Now there's some other as well that go some interesting things that I think is kind of interesting. Now, when they're in the land of Israel, what happens is as Israel was with the Moabites, they sinned their idols and everything. And all of a sudden, God sent Assyria, a nation that rose up a little later. Now, Assyria is an ancient nation, but we got to know what Assyria is Israel fighting. Neo Assyria, meaning new Assyria, a new Assyria that Israel is fighting. Now, this is why they just naturally just say Assyria, because it's just, you look at the time frame, we already should know that it would be Neo Assyria. If someone would ask, is this the same Assyria? Is it ancient Assyria? Is a change, right? This is a later Assyria, not Proto Assyria. It's gonna be Neo Assyria, not Middle Assyria, Neo Assyria, New Assyria. New Assyria comes out, and they are going to be a group that's going to be attacking the lands of Israel. Now we get one of the major kings named Shalmaneser. Now Shalmaneser is the one that destroys the kingdom of Israel. So one part of the land is destroyed and is witnessed, that is destroyed by the kings, multiple kings, right? We can pull up the Jerusalem Chronicles tablet. We can pull up a couple different tablets, but just getting a couple highlights is always important to get an understanding. Go down just to get, again, just those summaries of it. So it talks about a couple different things. Let me go back up. It talks about a couple different things. What's interesting, as these stones are obviously real, we know that they're talking about multiple different things in the land, where they talk about different trades, battles, different nations that are around there. What's interesting is it talks about this interesting piece of information. It just says about an alliance, that he makes an alliance. So it's really interesting. And it says this alliance comprising 11 kings was led by a certain peoples, whatnot, and ones of Damascus. It says describing also a large force led by King Ahab of Israel. Now almost anyone, if I say Jezebel, you're thinking you should know Ahab, right? So Jezebel, Ahab, this is pinning that together. Now you're thinking about Elijah and all the things that he did, right? You're thinking about the events that sometimes people, when they hear about about the spiritual events, they get thrown off, right? They fall off. They can't keep up with it, right? But if you keep speaking of the facts, they can understand that this is indeed going with a historical context that is all aligned and is making perfect sense. Because remember, Jezebel was not of Israel. She was of someone else and got married to the group. So that's very important. So that's going to be very important to know about what's happening in that land, right? But technically, joining with Israel, she became part of Israel. So not, and we already know, even when someone joins Israel, if they're not walking right with the way, that's one of those things. So we can see here that this group, sometimes they will be rebellious, sometimes they will follow with the Most High, but sometimes they will be rebellious. And that was one of the biggest things that we actually see with some of these writings. So we know without a doubt that this is a very important read of some information that is very vital for the biblical narrative, that is verifying what happened in that land, right? It's verifying what happened in that land, and it's verifying the fact of who is in the biblical narrative and how they are real people, right? So that's giving us a good understanding of this kingdom and a couple different things that they had going on, in that land, right? You can see a couple different pieces of information in it that they will talk. You can see a couple different things. There's one part on here where, remember, we talk about a couple things with Jehu and Arm and all those things. So about some different pieces of information, right? The list. So you can see, noticing, constantly go over the information. What you'll start doing, you might even, if you do it like this, you might be led, right? You might be led in a direction. You might be led in a direction. Now, me personally, I actually support Wiki. I don't support something like if you go on Wiki and it's just some quote without a source or anything like that's not good, because Wiki's a encyclopedia. Encyclopedias are very are needed, right? You got the Jewish encyclopedia, right, which is very powerful, a group of hermetic minds in agreement. The wiki is almost the same thing, a group of hermetic minds in agreement. Not everyone's all in agreement, but that's what's the point. Wiki gives the chance that you display your sources so that that situation can come together in harmony. Obviously, this is going to for giving direction. Obviously, like I said, you can go deeper into each one of these sources, right? You can build on these sources. You can go to other scholarly pieces of literature and expound on these sources. But this will give you the what's the word I'm looking for? The stepping stone. Something that's to understand this, so you can walk and guide yourself in giving the information of the evidence of God. Now, let's say, now remember, as the Old Testament, I can show you evidence up all the way to the Babylonians, right? By up to 500s and whatnot with the Babylonians, and then all the way up to 400s, the Medes and the Persians and all that. And then we can go all the way up to the Greeks. We can get the information of the Greeks, the evidence of the Jews being there with the Greeks. And then we get to the time of the Messiah. Now, that's when it gets kind of interesting, because the evidence of the Messiah, someone proving the Bible, that's one thing. But to prove the Bible, then you're getting more deeper into the gospel and the information that the early church would have had displayed. Not just the early church, but early historians, right? But this right here, I think the stones for the Old Testament, the stones speak the most, right? Once you start getting about to the time of the Greeks, let's say now you want to get this, obviously, if you don't know, you should know about the Cyrus cylinder. Let's say you want to, now you can give information for, like, the Jerusalem Chronicles, right? The Jerusalem Chronicles is going to give information about the Babylonians and stuff like that. You can also look up different information with the Babylonians. If you go Cyrus cylinder, right, that's going to give you obviously information on the Medes and the Persians, especially the Persians, which Cyrus was of, with his mother being a Mede. But it would give us a good information on what's going on in that time. It will give us some really good information on what's going on in a couple of different highlights. And there's other tablets within that time. There's other cuneiform tablets that are spread out. They're these square tablets throughout that time. But like you want to get to the time of, because it would be close to the transition. You get the Greeks, and let's say you get the time of the Greeks. I'm gonna tell you something that I use for the time of the Greeks. I something basically Isaiah Dead Sea Scrolls, which is one of the scrolls that's verified as one of the scrolls. So that's very important, as you got to know that some of the Dead Sea Scrolls long time ago were not, but some of them, like for example, they found a scroll of Isaiah. So they found an ancient scroll of Isaiah. So this is actually going to be a digital copy from here. This is going to be a real digital copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And let me also see how it's going. So any statements, anything like that, let me know. Shalom, shalom, family. Shalom, shalom. All right, looks good. This one is a great question. When Israel gets destroyed, is that Judah also? So that's a great statement. So that's why we have to have a timeline. So let's go back and get back a timeline. So we're gonna grab our timeline of Israel right here, and we just something simple. You want something that goes like you want to get something like a capture of time. I would say something from BC to about 100 AD. So I don't know if I'll find an exact one, but it's not too hard to find one. Should be fairly simple. I'll just put one. Okay, so this one's okay, but that one looks kind of confusing. I don't want to confuse anybody. I want to get a clear as possible one. This looks good. Well, yes, this looks good. Okay, so I'll use this to explain it. So this is what we're looking at. So we've seen that in the new kingdom of Egypt, we've seen that the Israelites came out. They came to the land of Israel, and that's when Israel and Judah developed, the house of David. And then the Neo-Assyrians popped up. So this is going to be the new Assyrians pop up. Then after the new Assyrians, there's actually a mid-transition before the Neo-Babylonians, which the Assyrians are there. And then a pharaoh called Pharaoh Necho of Egypt actually takes the land. And that time frame is about, you can see about here, it'll be about 700 BC, 600 700 BC, 800 BC. So between that time frame, because Pharaoh Necho actually attacks one of the kings named Josiah, and Josiah is pretty much killed. And then Pharaoh Necho of Egypt takes over the land. Then after Pharaoh Necho rules the land a little bit, Jehoiakim hits the throne, and that's when Babylon comes there a little later. Babylon comes there. That's when Neo-Babylon pops up. And when Neo-Babylon pops up, let me make sure I'm looking at that question so I answer exactly. Ephraim, also this one that get destroyed. This is okay. So this is where Israel is, Judah is destroyed. The first temple falls in the Neo-Babylon. Neo meaning new, not the Proto-Babylonians or the original. So that's important to know that there's different Babylonians. The more ancient past this time right here, past this time, Babylon started off with Kassites and Amorites and stuff like that. But now at this time, Neo-Babylonia, you got some a mixture in that group. So it's kind of a mixed group. So it was a Neo-Assyrians. There was a mixed group. And the Neo-Babylonians actually attack Judah and destroys the temple and destroys Judah, taking pretty much a lot of the kings of that land and taking them away. That's where you want to pull up I'll show you what you can find. Jerusalem Chronicles, right here. The Jerusalem Chronicles. And that would basically, or rather, not Jerusalem Chronicles, Babylonian. That's what it's called. Babylonian Chronicles. Let me make sure I state that right. You make sure you pull up this. This is, see how this tab looks right here? You want to make sure you pull up a tablet because it's going to give the exact pinpoint of the last kings of Judah to be taken, right? It's going to give you the last pinpoint of basically the last Judah being taken. And this is when Daniel started prophesying, right? Right at the end of Jeremiah and at the stretch of the end of Ezekiel. So that's going to be important. Let me actually show you what it says on the Babylonian Chronicles. This one's really, I'm gonna just go right down to a couple things. What's interesting here, as you can see, also have some other tablets here, letting us know that is right in the midst of history, right? But this one, what's interesting about this is the early years of Nebuchadnezzar, because it's Nebuchadnezzar that takes the sons of Judah, right? So remember, Israel is pretty much taken, but who's Judah? Benjamin, Levi, and Judah. So remember that Benjamin, Levi, and Judah is still there after Assyria takes Israel, the lands of the people. So remember, Israel would represent. I'm gonna try to say it off the dome. Gad, Naphtali, Ashkelon, Asher rather, uh, Issachar, Dan, Ephraim, Manasseh, who's Joseph, and a couple others. I probably got probably said some, and I don't remember exactly the ones I said, but that's an example. There's 10 tribes, right? I could pull up a picture just to point it out. But the ones who are not part of Judah, the ones who are not part of Judah, or the ones who are not part of Israel is Judah, which is Benjamin, Levi, and Judah. So that's very important. That's going to give us an understanding. But let's read a little bit of what's on this tablet. So this tablet actually pinpoint tells us that they take away right here right here. It doesn't talk. You don't go to it on Wiki, because Wiki doesn't give you the pinpoint. There's some very deep information on this tablet. Let me see it, give it to you real fast. Let me put Judah, so you can get a little read. I would go to this and type. I got it on a note, but I want to show you the methodology to find it. So if you're spot to find it, so right here, so you can find different pieces. This is one, but I try to stay from .com stuff. .com can be beneficial because it got some credit on some things, but I try to find like something more with a little more direct information and whatnot. This one is, let's see what this one is. Let's see what's on here. So yes, it's gonna be at the British. They're citing their source. This is the exact source. That's what you want to find. That is the exact source, right? Source cited, and he's basically, let's see if he reads right from it. Yep. So this is the read. This is the Bible verse. He puts the Bible verse with exactly what happens. I'm thinking that he reads exactly what is written on this. Let's see. Here he doesn't exactly have it word for word. I would rather go to a word for word. I'll show you guys a word for word reading on it real fast. Let's see. I'm going to it here. I think the best way is, going to a historical source, or something that you find that's going to pinpointly and everything. I have a source, but I want to basically show you, how you would find it like this, and then talk about the exact king. The exact king that's taken away is Jehoiachin. Jehoiachin is actually taken away. If I put his name, surely I should find, at least there it is. This source you want to find right here. This is going to go deeply into the pinpoint exact information of it. So that's why to find Babylonian Chronicles, Jehoiachin. And if you look on here, this is going to be the first time that Judah falls. The first time that Judah falls. And so we're going to note the exact pinpoint information, just like we've seen in the Bible, right? So look a little bit of what's written on this stone here. So let's go a little down. So this one, let me make sure. See, this one is okay. I'm gonna actually leave that one right there. This one that looks like this is okay too. I'm just gonna leave that one there, but this is the one you want right here. And you want to find it. You want to find it in this page right here. So let me see if I can just find it right on this page, because this page have the information to it. Let's see. Let's see if I can find it right on this page. I typed it in weird. I must have mistyped Babylonian real fast. Did I see Babylonian? Oh, Babylonian. Let's see. Because Babylon. Let me copy it and post it because I probably typed out weird. Babylonian Chronicles. But you want to find it on this one that's going to read it word for word, because it when you read it word for word, it sounds better than having a scholar read it. It's probably, I don't know why the search on here doesn't work that well, but I'll find it like this. What you want to do? This one's nice too, but you want to find it on this thing. So let me actually copy it from here and see if I can find that. Let's see. Because you want to find the stone that looks like this one. If it's this, if it's going to read it from here. So I got a little tip at the top of it like that. You got this lip right there. This one didn't have information on it. Right here. Okay, so here's the page. So here it is. This is some Chronicles. This will be nice to throw in with it, right? There's going to be also the exact time frame. So these are going to be two stones that's going to be witnessing to the last kings of Judah. So this is how the last kings of Judah fell. It's about 599 BC. This all happened. As soon as Nebuchadnezzar got there, it was a couple things. So I'm gonna go down to right to this exactly word for word was written on that stone. So it just talks about Nebuchadnezzar, a couple of different things. Just gonna jump down a little bit. You want to go down till you see the king of Judah. You can also find it like this. You can search on this page, Judah, like that, and then you got it right there. One quote on it. This is what happened pretty much. We're gonna read it from here. In the 7th year, about 599 BC, they say 598, 597, something like that. In the month of this one, the king of Akkad. Now it says the king of Akkad. Why does it call him king of Akkad? Because previously he took Akkad, pretty much. He actually fought against the king of Akkad. He talks about the kings of Akkad and all those different things. So that's important that he calls himself later king of Akkad. In his writing, you'll see that right here. We'll notice that we'll get some information and talk about certain kings of Akkad had a powerful army. Then all of a sudden you get different things that's talking about different things. Talk about Akkad left and everything. But then he called himself king of Akkad. That's actually Nebuchadnezzar, pretty much. It says the king of Akkad musters his army of troops and marched to the Hatti land. It's a Hatti land, right? He attacks the Hittites and everything, fights with the Hittites, and then besieged the city of Judah on the 2nd day of the month of Adar. That's exactly, notice the note right here. That's exactly the exact understanding that it was on this month, just like this note, that was exactly like what the scripture says at Jeremiah 52 and 28 and 30 and 2 Kings, which the book, this is why the Bible is a source, because it agrees with itself and history agrees with it. So it actually shows itself perfectly pinpoint correct to the time, to the exact month and day. Is very pinpoint on these things. But what makes it more pinpoint is we know biblically how it happened. It wasn't only that Nebuchadnezzar killed the king, he took a king and renamed him and placed him in the land of Judah himself. So that's important. The last king was placed by Nebuchadnezzar. So we can also know that this is actually talking about Nebuchadnezzar. Just pull up that it doesn't say Nebuchadnezzar down there, but this same Nebuchadnezzar here, he later becomes the king of Akkad, pretty much in this transition. He becomes the king of Akkad. And we can go a little bit down back to what we were just looking at. Right? He fights against Arabs and other different, but back to the king of Judah. Notice the exact details of the event. It says he sieged the city. So he attacked the city. He didn't just attack the city. It says, and captured the king. So exactly like the scripture says, just like we see in scripture, about that there had went up and he besieged the city and captured the king and everything. And notice what else it says right here. He appointed their own choice. So notice the detail here. Notice the detail here. That is that he appointed a king of his own choice, just like the Bible says. Jehoiachin's, right? When Jehoiachin was taken, his uncle Mattaniah, right, basically became king of Judah, right? And he changed his name to Zedekiah. Remember that? Nebuchadnezzar took the king of Judah, set him on. Nebuchadnezzar took Mattaniah, one of the kings of the one of the brothers, pretty much the brother, made him king, right? So that's important. That's just Jehoiakim's brother. Mattaniah was Jehoiakim's brother. He took him and made him king. Now, the reason why that's important, because not only did he siege the city, and take the king, right? Not only did he do that, not only did he seize the city and take the king, he appointed there a king of his own choice. That's exactly, and then received tribute because he's made him head over that area. So that he sent tribute to Babylon. That's exactly like the biblical narrative says. It's pinpoint accurate with history. It's pinpoint accurate. Let's get a little more detail into some of these events. We can actually get a little more information on a couple of different things of these events later on. If you remember, what was the thing that was allowed to Jehoiachin? Now remember, what did he say about king? The king. Remember what he did to the king. He did not kill the king, as it says. He seized the city. He captured the king. Now that's just like the biblical narrative says. Jehoiachin was taken. Now, if we have evidence of Jehoiachin living in that land, living and coming to alive, then this is very, very pinpoint. Let's read a little stone right here of a cuneiform stone mentioning Jehoiachin, right? So it says, in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, in the 12th month, in the 12th month, in the 27th day of the month, evil Murdoch. So evil Murdoch is like he's a king after Nebuchadnezzar. So he's gonna be right slap dad after Nebuchadnezzar. And not only is he after Nebuchadnezzar, he also is the one that releases Jehoiachin. So he's like evil Murdoch, king of Babylon, in the year he began to reign, right? Graciously fed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison. He spoke kindly to him, right? What's going on here? He's speaking kindly to him. You see what's going on here? He spoke kindly to him, right? Because he's gonna let him out. Everything. Watch when we look at the historical information to kind of get a little understanding of it. So obviously, he took off his garments and he let him at the king's table, right? Gave him allowance and everything. His portions all his life. So remember, there's also a prophecy later on that talks about for Jehoiakim to continue, for them to continue multiplying in that land. There's a lot of children of Jehoiakim that lived, a lot of sons of Judah that are actually, even to this day, sons of Jehoiachin. Right? Very, very deep when you think about that in multiple ways. But let's go down and a more understanding of some things that's going on here, right? And just go on and talk about a couple different things here. We actually point out something here. I'm gonna read what is basically a summary of it. One of the last kings of Judah, Jehoiachin, was taken in captivity by the Babylonians. So we know that's a thing for sure. And lived in exile in the country of the conquerors. However, he was released, and a couple of cuneiform tablets from Babylonia informs us about his fate. So let us know about his release and about his fate. So get a little understanding about what's happening here on some things, right? So it just lets you know that evil Murdoch, actually his name would be something like I'm not gonna try to Amel Murdoch, evil Murdoch, right? It talks about a couple of different things. What happens with him when his father dies, right? It talks about what happens and what goes on and everything. And it talks about one of the kings of Judah, right? Because he's actually one of the kings of Judah. But here's what it says: there are several cuneiform texts that illustrate Jehoiachin's position after his release, which were discovered by Roberts, this person right here, in Babylon. So, and are collectively known as these. All right. So this is something a little more into it, right? And you can open it up and get a little more highlights of the information. And this is what it says. It says these documents are in Berlin, are list of deliveries of food and oil to important people, and prove that the king of Judah, because they probably would write, send such and such oil to the king of Judah that we had took, that I like, and I have him sitting at my table, eat it with me. So that's what we're seeing, is that they're seeing that they're getting documents of a king of Judah living with that king of Babylon that released, that, as the scripture said, he released him and sat down and ate with him. He sat down and ate with that man. So that's deep to let us know that a king of Judah at that time, spoken of as one of Judah, is going to be fed, right? So it's going to be very important that he's actually sitting with them and actually going to be eating. So it says, to important people, and prove that the king of Judah, who is called, this is his name right here, right? They got a little name for him. I know Kim, Iokim, just like Jehoiachin, right? Iokim, right? However you say that. Ioku o Chin. I don't know. I'm gonna try to. I'm not gonna try, but that's what they got a name for him, just like a Chin, right? Sounds very familiar, right? But they're not gonna be using that Semitic. They're gonna be using something a little different. But they talk about that king. It says to Il Chin, king, right? They call him a king, right? That's how we know what's going on when he's saying to give that food to him and whatnot. A lot of different pieces. So they got different pieces, different documents, different pieces that are connecting this fact of him, right? Talk about his oil, right? Giving them some oil and some things right now. You see right there, he's talk about some things. Another piece where it talks about that same Io right there. I don't know where is that, somewhere on this, maybe. I don't know. Maybe right here. Let's just say this one and this one. This one kind of right here. His son, whatnot. Maybe. But this one, and this one, I would say more kind of points out that information. So this is another piece that lets us know that, yeah, that king was taken, and it had evidence of that king in the land of Babylon. Word for word, again, word for word, we know that that last king, the only king that was taken by Babylon, was Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin, and the last king that he set up. And that's the king that he actually mentions, as it says, right? He besieged Judah on the second star, right? That was at that last bit and he seized the city and captured the king. So he took the king, and that king lived, and we got the recording of that king being served and coming out at this time of evil Murdoch, just like it says in the Bible. And then, exactly like it says in the Bible, Nebuchadnezzar appointed, it says he appointed there a king of his own choice and received heavy tribute, right, to him. So he also set up Mattaniah, who he changed his name to Zedekiah. So that's exactly, going back to the timeline, that's how, that around the time of the Neo-Babylon, until the Persians come in, when um, Daniel was living, that's when Jerusalem falls. This is when Jerusalem falls. So about 500, that's when Jerusalem falls. A little earlier, that's when Israel had fell. That'd be Ephraim, Manasseh, and the other 10, the 10 tribes that were brought down in a way 11. Basically, Joseph. So they say 10. The Neo-Babylonians is when Jerusalem falls, when the actual first temple falls. But remember, later on, during the Persians, they rebuild it during the time of Ezra. So they end up rebuilding it. You could almost say it's like a type of re-established kingdom, like a neo-kingdom. But I wouldn't call it neo-Israel. I wouldn't, because whenever a kingdom falls, usually when it rises again, you call it a neo-empire. But they return back to their same everything. Right, everything's the same. It's not neo as in a new change. It's the same. Everything's about the same, right? And they're trying to keep it that, but the only separation is that now they're divided. They're so divided that they're waiting for a restoration. Now, that's something to know. Once the second temple comes, we all should know that they're waiting for a restoration. There's a prophecy of a Messiah, of a savior that's going to come to bring the people to a promised land and restore the people. So it's a promise that's going to happen later on. So that's when the promise comes about the time of the Persians. So in this mid time, but then they go through this hard trouble like a beast, right? They go through a type of beast, and it was prophesied by Daniel. And during the time of the Maccabean revolts, right? You probably already seen it. You probably have seen the things that were happening throughout that time with the Greeks and everything before the rise of the Romans. That we seen in this time frame, right before the transition of the Romans, we seen that Israel was going through it in the time of the Greeks. Now, not a lot of people know about that, but they call it the silent years concerning the biblical text. They'll say there's no prophecies and stuff like that. But Israel still exists and living through that, right? They're living through that until the promise comes that they're going to be restored. It doesn't cut off there, right? The story doesn't end there, or else it's a sad story because it ends on a curse, right? Malachi ends on a curse, right? But we understand that there's a promise for a salvation, a promise of something, of a new covenant, not like the covenant of old, but a new covenant, as is prophesied by Jeremiah, right? That one day will come a new covenant, right? And that would bring the old Israel back to Judah and bring Judah back to Israel. And that will bring the people together and bring them to a restored temple. But that's speaking more, how you say, eschatology, getting more deep into the future. But this is an understanding of the historical context. Is that the historical context is going to give a good understanding. The like I said, the best source for this time frame, just go to Isaiah scroll, because the age of this scroll is about the time of the Maccabeans. So you can see early BC, because this will also complement for the coming of Christ, right? Especially Isaiah 53, right? Isaiah 53 is going to give you a little understanding of the coming of Christ. So it's prophesying, letting us know of his coming and different things like that to give us some understanding of what we know around. But we know Isaiah was around 700 BC. There's no doubt. His historical context is on point. His historical context is on point. We even know that it matches exactly with the time when Hezekiah was besieged, right? Matches exactly when Hezekiah was besieged by the Assyrians. There's no doubt that Isaiah lived during the time of the Assyrians. But we have a BC copy, which is very, very interesting to kind of fill in some area of that time frame. Kind of get that. So I guess full understanding to that question, Israel gets destroyed, is that Judah also? So only Israel at that time. Only Israel is destroyed. And then a little later, Judah falls. So later, Judah falls. Just for the full understanding on that. All scrolls they found at Qumran. Yes, that's right. They are legit. That's right. That's right. Yep, the one on that area of bogus. That's right. Thanks for that information. So that's a highlight. That's a great highlight. Shalom, Iron Matt. Shalom, shalom, shalom. So let's get a little more. So now let's say that history was interesting and everything. Let's say now I see that you're transitioning to the New Testament, but there's a lot of people who think the New Testament was this mystical thing that was made by the Romans later in the 300s and all that stuff. But did you know that the earliest sources for Christ are all first century sources? That there's dozens of first century sources for Christ, and not only for his existence, but for his character, how he is, how he had the saints, and what was his cause. Now remember the state of the land, that Jerusalem just fell, right? And then they rebuilt it. Now, it was only Judah that was allowed to be saved at that city. Only Judah. And not just only Judah. It had to be Judah of the women of Judah. That's important. That means they had to be the previous women that they had before. That means if they mix, they would be cut off. That would be very risky and dangerous if they mixed. And if they kept that mix, if they stayed with that person. But what happened was, after the time of Ezra, when the people was gathered together in that land, only Judah, and then Messiah came. Notice that Messiah says something interesting when he pops up. He says salvation is of the Jews. It's true. Salvation is of the Jews, because a Jew, right? Even if we go back to the ancient way that we say Jew, right? It wouldn't be said as Jew, but rather it would be a resident of Jerusalem. If we break down the whole way that word is made, that is actually a resident of that land. It's someone that belongs to Judah, someone that belongs to Jerusalem, right? So it would be a inhabitant that is one with the land. that's one with that land. But then something interesting happened. So remember, in that land at the second temple that's not the foundation yet, because we know that that's established for a coming of the Messiah. We know that because Daniel 9:24-27 talks pinpoint about a Messiah. And I'm not going to do the math now, but there's a prophecy in it that if you do the math, it exactly goes from the time that Ezra sets the people up until the time that Messiah is basically hitting the picture and goes through what he goes through. But let's talk about some sources real fast. Let's get a little bit on some sources. So let's say you had to prove, let's say you was on a spot real fast, so you believe, right? Even if let's say they want to know. One of the best sources that I would say, there's a lot of sources, but if you're on the spot, you need to find something to price. I think one of the best sources, or one of the earliest sources, is see if I remember how it's spelled. The Didache, right? The Didache is one of the earliest, and I would say these what the saints had did, right? It talks about the baptisms and a couple of different things like that. We have scholars that actually say that it's probably first century. It has evidence of being first century. Some people try to say second century, but we have information that is probably most likely first century writing. Right, it's something that is going to be very important to know a little bit about. It's also the Didache. It basically means the Lord's teachings through the 12 nations. Right, that's what it basically is. It's an early writing by the Christians. Right here, you can see it dates to the modern scholars to the first or less commonly second century. So some try to say less commonly because not a lot of scholars are actually saying the second century. They're saying it's first century. That's what they're saying, that this writing is actually first century. And what it writes of is the church order. It's the order. It doesn't just. It's not just writing. It's not just writing of a summary, a skim. It's giving some directions in the church. So what it is evidence. It's external evidence that they had an order to Christianity, to the faith. They had an order to it, and they know that they were Jews. That's what's important too. Is that the Didache was written by people who had ruled early, but they know that they were most likely Jewish. In fact, it says right here, as other scholarly places will also say, as this would be most likely a highlight from, you can see right here from this piece of information of the Didache and faith, a couple different things of the look at that time frame, 50 to 70 AD, first century, right? So that scholar is saying is most likely first century. But this is what a summary of it. The Didache reveals how Jewish Christians, that's what's important about it, is that not a lot of people actually know that the first Christians were Jewish. They were first Jews. The Christians before Jerusalem fell 70 AD, the earliest Christians were Jews. The first ones. The first Christians were Jews. In fact, some of the best evidence that we have is from a Jew. There is a person who converted a Jew who was a priest, and it's very deep. But for that one, we would have to go a little more deeper into sources. So I have a source. The best way to type it down, we can go about that. We can go about going about that source. But this one is like about how the Jewish Christian communities and how they lived and everything. And it says how they saw their. Now, notice what about the Didache? The Didache reveals how Jewish Christians saw themselves and how they adapted their practice, right, for Gentile Christians. So this is Jews. If you notice, also in the book of Acts and other places, they talk about the Gentiles, the difference between the Gentiles and the Jews. They say, for example, Peter says, he says a statement. He says, we don't command the Gentiles to keep all the laws of the ancient. When I say all the laws, I'm saying like laws of Moses, all that. They say they tell them to sustain from fornication, to sustain obviously from idols, to sustain from blood, and from things strangled and things killed, things like that. When it's coming to certain things, this is actually important because it gives us an understanding that is very similar to the book of Matthew, which we also can verify early in history, because we have early writings of Matthew. But we also, what is important about this one is that it gives us a culture fulfillment, that the scripture is right, that it started with Jews, that it was Jews that were first brought up by Christ. That Christ was speaking to Jews, converting them, and the Jews started to convert the people around. Like Paul was a Jew, Peter was a Jew. All those Jews were converting people around. That's what was happening. Is that the Jews have received this message from this Messiah that arrived to receive a gospel message of a restoration that would happen to the people, right? So that's what makes it important, is that the Didache is basically summarizing right from Jewish writers about their assimilation of the gospel and bringing it to a nation that will be outward, right? So that's why I would say the Didache would be a nice source to go to, because these will be ancient, early copy writings. Early, we got different parchment of it, right? But pretty much it's one of those things that is going to be one of those early pieces of literature. Here's something to kind of get a little more highlight on it of the Didache. So it just gives a little bit of information on some things, so they know there's a lot of things that's written in it that brings it to 50 AD, right? Because they talk about certain things that happened or not. It says it has depicted by scholars as anything between the original of the uh, apostolic doctrine or decree in 50 AD, right? So that's something that is super early to the time of the biblical context. So it's going to give us some other, and there's a lot of other historical references that we can go to really bring it home. But this is kind of like a first, I would say, as a historical context, a first introduction of the early birth of Christianity and the rise of the faith during that time in that land. So we can get a good understanding. Here's an example. The scribe who copied these 7 texts signed the last leaf as, let me see, lean. This one. Okay, these are just some scholarly insights on it. You can get nice scholarly insights. I thought that was like a nice little highlight. We don't need that right now, but it gets a lot of information. We know that they will also be those Jews right here. He have a source on it right here. You can see on source criticism on K right here. It says there seems to be a general consensus that the two ways material uh, material in chapters 1 and 6 a prehistory that connects with Jewish ethical concerns. So what's going on here, got some obviously connections to some very important things, right? It's still following the history, but it's continuing on to the fulfillment of the whole picture, of the whole way, right? So it's important that we're letting us know of Jews will have connection to people of that land. So that would be one document. And what I would use as a source also is that on my page, I have a source with nothing but scholarly videos. I got a real fast. See if I can point it out. Alongside that flood. So very right. Because we some deep things, but that's just because we're getting very deep into biblical text that at this point I read it so many times that it just makes sense that we go over the history of it. But let me show you. If you go to my playlist right here, and you go to, or rather right on this last part right here, right over here, you can see the apologetics, right? You click it, and the disciple is, you'll see a couple of different videos that we did on a bunch of different historical sources and everything. And if you want to, it's also something you can use, right, to go over. So let me make a closer highlight of it right here. So what you can actually do is you can see that there's a couple different channels that I think go deep into it. There's others multiple of others, but I think some of these will be similarly pinpoint information. So each one of these videos, I think, are solid source having source providing evidence of Christianity. For example, this one.
The old maps of Paul's letters are stored in a beautiful gardens of Dublin Castle, and it's here we find our quotation. Our frame is the earliest example of Christian oral tradition. Here, the Apostle Paul reminds the Corinthians of a fixed summary of the Christian faith, which he passed on to them years earlier, and which he himself had received shortly after his conversion. Mainstream scholars date this summary to within months of Jesus' death.
Hoti Christos apethenen huper ton hamartion hemon katatas graphas. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. Kai hoti etaphe, and that he was buried. Kai hoti egergatai te hemera te trite katatas graphas, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. Kai hoti ofther kerfa eta tois dodeca, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12.
These words were in common Christian usage before the year 35.
Whatever I want to say about the basic plot of Jesus, it clearly wasn't a legend growing up over.
This summary or creed provides evidence that the broad narrative of Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and appearances was being taught and memorized decades before the details were written in the Gospels.
All right. So let me make a highlight for this little video. You see this video? This will be yours. First century real documents of Paul's writings. Now we can also go into the history of Paul. We actually got history of Paul's journey in Arabia. You can actually, if you ever wanted to, history of it. Because Paul was actually a real person with a lot of historical background to him. And remember, he's a Jew that left the areas of Rome, being there. Whereas put Paul in Arabia. Historical. If you could probably find it, there's some historical documents. I don't know if they make it easy or hard, but I got some historical documents of Paul Arabia. It's probably going to talk about it and whatnot. It was in 49 AD. AD. These are we're talking historical documents, real historical documents. Paul in Arabia, 49 AD. The Nabateans first appear as a power on the historical sense, and a couple of that. But this is actually important that we actually got real history of Paul in Arabia. So that's something that's actually really interesting. If you want to go into it or see a little bit of that, because that's a lot of I say fine information of this Paul and what he does in some All right, I had to let me refresh this real fast. All right, so and also, if you are someone that is curious, reading the book again, just want to talk about the word and stuff like that on my page, just like where you can see these little sources and stuff. These, like I said, every one of these is scholarly. Every one of these videos is scholarly because you know how we get down in sources. Sources, I try to make sure that they're super scholarly. We got this little page, great page, Gospel in Spades, that goes over all sources. Just go a breakdown on a lot of different sources. Got a lot of different apologetics and everything. But if you go to my page, another major sources for this topic page, if you go to my About Me right here and you go down, you can actually go to where it says links and click here where it says Holy Conversation. And if you did that, you would go to my Discord. So just join the Discord. I already have one on here just to kind of show what happens. Joins. And I don't do no verification or nothing. Just have conversations with them. And you can go to where it says history videos, and we have a lot. We got apologetic information. So information on apologetics. We're talking major information. One of the brothers just shared something interesting right here. What do Roman and Jewish sources tell us about Jesus? So that's probably a very deep, interesting source. So it gives us a lot of historical first century writings, right? Tacticus, right? That's some deep stuff. We got a lot of different sources on stuff. I just scroll up for this one, right? This one just talks about, this is interesting for evidence for the Exodus, the 10 plagues of the Exodus, right? A lot of people already probably know about this papyrus, that there's evidence for the Exodus, right? There's also, some people say it's probably older than the Exodus, so use it or not use it. But there's also evidence of the Exodus. I think I put this here because I think IP did a great review of the Exodus, as well as this Egyptologist. There's a great evidence of Exodus, providing different information on historians talking about this and everything. Also, remember I was talking about Paul in Arabia. Here's all the sources, or some of the sources of Paul in Arabia right here. These actually would be some of the sources. I think this will be kind of an interesting source too. Paul in Arabia right here. This would be kind of an interesting source. But you can see there's going to be a little information of those things. And we keep a fairly small circle and everything just to kind of keep things peaceful and whatnot. Everything, I don't allow hedonism. I don't allow nothing that's not scholarly. Everything got to be, on point with stuff. But as you can see, what time frame? Remember, I talked about 40 AD, right? We could talk about a couple different things that happened. So I'm talking real scholarly historical sources that actually shows the movements of Paul. So you can see Arabia, right? Talk about his hidden years. Talk about this was 2021. We got information. There's news that's coming out. Paul in Arabia. Again, we're talking not the Gnostic stuff and all that extra stuff, all that. We're talking real historic documents of how Paul first went into Arabia, into this area of the Nabatean kingdom, and all these different things, and what he did there. A couple different things. He even speaks about it in Galatians 1 and 16, right? When he says he went to Arabia, right? And he does a couple things. And we know we got historical documents of him going there, right? We got historical documents of him going into that area and going to do a couple different things. So got a couple different things, right? So a lot of to that, and other things that is interesting. This is early sources for how saints basically got along. You got Ignatius of Antioch. You got Justin Martyr. These are some early saints, right? First, second century saints and what they did, right? What they stood for and everything. Irenaeus, he's a great saint. Clement of Alexandria, I don't really like that much. Clement of Antioch, I like. but Clement of Alexandria, but Origen, he's I like to stay more around under 300 AD. I like to find sources under 300 AD and stuff. Because everyone want to talk about the council of blah 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 in 300 with uh, Constantine and all that madness. But that's just if people probably more historical context of those things. But that's what we have here, more historical, right? You can see this one where it talks about biblical scholar. Um, this one right here, Bruce says the earliest mention of Jesus outside the New Testament occurs around 55 AD, but there's some earlier ones from a historian named Delios. Delios' history, like a vast majority of ancient literature, has been lost, but not before it was quoted by another person. So that's what's important, is that sometimes you might find lost documents, but if it's quoted by another, it'll verify what we're seeing on some of these things. As it says, Delios in the third book of histories calls the darkness as appears to me without reason an eclipse of the sun. For the Hebrews celebrate the Passover on the 14th day according to the moon, right? According to the moon. And the suffering of our Savior falls on the day before the Passover. So you see what's going on there? So very, very important, because that's what Messiah was taken one day before the Passover and became the Passover, right? So very important. But an eclipse of the sun takes place on the moon, sun. So you know how it talks about how our Savior, Messiah, early sources, that's earlier historians that are quoting Messiah, that are talking about Messiah and his existence in that area. So there's actually a lot of sources, but there's a little more highlights. Obviously, got to talk about ancient roots and stuff, but also other evidences of when were certain documents out, like this one, right? One of the earliest verifications. I think this was one of the earliest verifications for the canonization of the book, right? You think of the letters of the book that we approve. Here they are, right here. The first verified
of the New Testament,
right? Athanasius of Alexandria. There's some earlier ones, there's some other ones, but I think this one was like one of the most solid. So this is before the Council of Nicaea and all that. But he verifies all the books. He verifies the 12 books. He verifies Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He verifies all the saints before the said Council of Nicaea. So he even verifies Paul's letters and stuff. He verifies all those things. So that's something that's important, So when it comes to the history, that's what it'll come to, is getting a full understanding of the history of how the church grew and why God wanted to save the people this way. This was the new covenant that he wanted to make, is to change the people to walk in righteousness and everything, right? To get a good understanding of those things, of what was happening with that. So there's some other stuff, close that. So that's why I would say it'd be more pinpointing historical, how the biblical narrative is verified as a book of true history, right? That's what I'll say. The summary, right? That's going about it. If you got to prove the Old Testament, go to the stones, right? If you got to prove the Old Testament, go to the stones. Go to the stones. Prove by the Old Testament stones or the old historical stones that verify the narrative of the biblical narrative as it went about, until it's copies in the Septuagint and all that. And then I would say for the New Testament, pull up the papers, the skins of the papers, right? Pull up the documents, the historical quotes, all those things. So stones in the Old Testament that cries out about the Messiah, his coming soon, into the picture, right? And then the documents, the papaya and the all those and whatnot, skins and whatnot, those are going to be great for verifying Messiah, especially those historical quotes around that time. So I just want to make that understood, that yes, the biblical narrative is a very historical source. So quoting from the Bible is quoting a source, right? That's important. That is actually considered a very ancient source. So it's a chief of sources, is what I would say. That would be the chief of sources. But that will give us an understanding. So obviously, Messiah will exist in the Roman time. So he exists in the last kingdom, which is counting. Remember, he talks about these certain kingdoms that's going to reign. And that last kingdom, which actually is going to be the kingdom of Rome, proceeds to the end, right? We're still pretty much in the divisions of what is the broken pieces of Rome. As we see, even Rome fell, Byzantine continued on and whatnot. Then you get later kingdoms, right? Rome by another name, pretty much what it would be. So this is actually going to be a good understanding, is that that's when that time comes in for the biblical narrative. So the biblical narrative, you can show a lot of evidence from pretty much the time that they to this time that will compile the evidence and understanding of how the biblical narrative, or the book, the Bible, is actually a verifiable and trustworthy source. So with that, family, if you got any questions, otherwise, that's all I got today. I got some other stuff I'm gonna point out a little later and whatnot, but that's all I got for now. May you be blessed.